This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 621st episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Before we get started, just a quick note to acknowledge that, as you may have noticed, I took a couple weeks off from the podcast, mostly to celebrate and recover from the book launch for my brand new book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs, The Hero's Journey and Beyond. It was honestly a wonderful launch. I had so much fun. The book did really well. And it was so lovely to hear from so many of you who, so quickly really, that you were already diving into the material and getting so much out of it. As you've probably gathered, this book has been very dear to my heart, mostly because it nurtured me through and was the product of a very deep chapter in my own life. And really, it's my hope that it will be that for you as well. I see this book as so much more than just a writing guide. I absolutely believe it will help you tap into the kind of depth and meaning that will help you write better stories. But by their very nature, archetypes have this power to transform all those who come into contact with them. I know that was certainly my experience. So anyway, this is just to say that I'm back. The book is out. It's available in paperback on Amazon and ebook format on all major retailers and my site, of course. And the audiobook will be coming later this summer. And I hope you buy it and read it and love it. And if you do love it, please leave me a review. Also, one last note. I think I mentioned this last month, but I'm doing videos again. I'm doing an interactive writing Q&A series. You can find it on YouTube and participate with your own questions. And I've also been experimenting some with Instagram and have actually been having a lot of fun and posting lots of content over there that you can't find anywhere else. So check that out as well. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Prologues versus Flashbacks, and this will be Backstory Techniques Part 1 of 2. If you want to rev up a group of passionate writers, just bring up the topic of backstory. As much as we love our stories, we often love our backstories even more. If a plot offers a what and a how, backstory is often the why. It can provide both context and subtext, bringing depth, understanding, and subtle nuance to a character's journey through the main story. Handled well, backstory techniques can elevate your entire story. Handled poorly, backstory can ruin the entire experience for your audience. Now, I've written many posts and podcasts about important considerations such as how to discover your character's backstory, the right time to share backstory, when to avoid backstory altogether, and what to do when your backstory becomes your story. So you can find all of those topics by searching my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. But today I want to talk about what is the best way to interpolate backstory into the main plot. I want to talk about specific backstory techniques you will need to choose between when sharing your characters' histories with your audience. The goal should be to fully satisfy audiences' curiosity without slowing down the momentum of the main plot. And this can be easier said than done, and largely comes down to the right choice of one of 4 techniques: prologue, flashback, linear timeline, or alternate timeline. We will discuss the first 2 in today's episode and the second 2 in next week's episode. Now, this discussion was inspired by Amazon's recent limited neo-Western series, The English, starring Emily Blunt, about an English woman on a mission of revenge who becomes the unlikely traveling companion of a decommissioned Pawnee cavalry scout. Now, on the whole, I quite liked the show, particularly the relationship between the 2 leads. But one area in which I felt it faltered was its execution of backstory. Now, the backstory reveal in The English is a huge moment that changes everything in the plot, but both its timing and the chosen technique of a lengthy flashback comprising an entire episode muddied the story's pacing and momentum. I will discuss what went wrong when we talk about flashbacks in a minute, as well as sharing how the other potential backstory techniques that we're going to talk about might have been better choices. Now, needless to say, this entire series, this episode and next week's, will be filled with spoilers for The English. So if you don't want to know what the backstory reveal is, probably better stop now and watch the show first. Now, first, let us examine the differences between a complex backstory and a simple backstory. When the events of your character's pasts are incidental to the events of the main plot or the character's personal development in that plot, your story isn't likely to require any particular technique to share it with readers. This is a simple backstory. A complex backstory, on the other hand, is a backstory that greatly impacts the events and development in the main plot. Indeed, as in the English, the backstory may be driving everything that happens in the main plot. Complex backstories are often used in stories that feature one or more of the following. Number one, complicated motivations, in which the characters' reasons for pursuing their main plot goals are not straightforward or are born out of the character's inner conflict. For example, in the English, Cornelia Locke seeks vengeance against the father of her dead child, whom she holds responsible for his death. Number two, secrets characters are keeping from each other, in which characters are not sharing important information, usually about their motivations, with other characters. For example, Cornelia keeps many secrets from Eli Whip, her traveling companion, including the truth about her child's father and the child's manner of death. Number three, secrets characters are keeping from themselves, in which characters may not know their own pasts as well as they believe, either because they are deluding themselves and cannot face the truth, or because they are missing key pieces of information. For example, characters may learn the truth about a dead parent or grandparent, changing their perspective on their own journeys. And finally, number four, secrets the author is keeping from the readers, in which characters know the truth of the past, but the author purposefully keeps the audience in the dark to allow for a reveal later on. This is the trickiest approach since it can put audiences at a remove from characters' development, and sometimes even leave them feeling tricked by the author. Now, in all cases, backstory information will be shared as either context or a reveal. If the backstory is simply contextual, then it is presented as basic information readers need to know in order to understand what is going on. For example, the English casually explains Cornelia's rank as a lady in England, as well as Eli's service in the U.S. Cavalry. Neither bits of info are reveals, they are simply information necessary to build the story world. On the other hand, if the backstory is used to create a reveal, then it must bear much more weight within the main story. It becomes a pivot point. The very act and timing of its revelation changes the perception of the audience and or the characters, preferably both. For example, the English saves up several important pieces of information, but none so shocking as the identity of Cornelia's child's father, whom audiences were led to believe was someone else. When planning your backstory, a good rule of thumb is that complex backstories are best for simple stories. Simple backstories are best for complex stories. So if your main plot is complicated in its own right, then a complex backstory that requires much explanation and many reveals may not be the best choice. But if your main plot is relatively simple with a straight through line, a complex backstory can add depth and nuance. All right, so let's talk about when flashbacks work best for sharing backstory. Backstory and flashbacks are synonymous in some writers' minds. The flashback is the technique of interjecting a dramatized scene from a character's past into the main part of the story. The advantages of flashbacks is that they are visceral and immediate, allowing audiences to experience the backstory with just as much potency as any of the scenes in the main part of the story. They are also detailed, which ensures complicated events can be fully explored and explained. The disadvantages of flashbacks is that they necessarily stop the progression of the main part of the story. They require audiences to be patient while a new scene or scenes is carefully fleshed out, sometimes with an entirely different or altered cast of characters. So, short flashbacks are usually best, especially if you're introducing them late into the story with no foreshadowing of a time shift, such as you would have in a story with an alternating timeline, as we'll discuss in next week's post. However, if you do decide you want to include a lengthy flashback of more than a short scene, make sure it is dramatic enough to carry its own weight. The longer a flashback, the more dramatic it should be. Avoid exposition. Flashbacks should not be about explaining things to audiences, but only about providing answers to questions that have already been set up to hook their curiosity. Flashbacks need to introduce new information that turns the main plot. By nature, flashbacks pull audiences out of the main story, which means whatever you share in the flashback should be riveting enough to pull them right back in. Now, for our example, The English shares its major backstory reveal in a lengthy flashback that comprises an entire episode, which in this story is an entire sixth of its overall length. So in this instance, the flashback was arguably not the right choice. One of the main reasons for this is that the episode focuses primarily on the antagonist rather than the protagonists. In this instance, the problem is compounded further by the fact that the antagonist was never introduced in the story up to this point. In fact, he has been barely acknowledged beyond a few mentions of his name and a vague indication that minor characters dislike him. Because this flashback was poorly set up, it interrupts the pacing and momentum of the main story. It forces the audience to leave behind the story they have so far invested in, which was the relationship between the two leads, to spend a great deal of time with characters who they neither know nor like. Now, had the antagonist been better set up, the flashback would have felt more important to the story rather than coming as a bolt from the blue that audiences don't really care about until after it's over. Okay, so now let's talk about when prologues work best. Prologues can take many forms. Sometimes they might be a flash forward to show an event from later in the story. Other times they are used as an atmospheric hook to set the tone and plant a quick bit of foreshadowing to be paid off later in the story. Most often, however, they are used as a sort of flashback in their own right, to show a glimpse into an important moment in the character's backstory before the audience flips ahead to the main plot. The advantages of prologues. Thanks to their positioning at the very beginning of the story, prologues set the stage. And this means they never need to be foreshadowed or set up, as do flashbacks. They are the setup. If the prologue is effective, that is, if it's more than just an info dump, it can frame the entire story by hinting at what important revelation the entire story is building toward. Prologues are also relatively short, quick, and dirty. They let authors get the backstory out of the way so they can then pursue the main plot uninterrupted. Now, the disadvantages of prologues. Like flashbacks, prologues live apart from the main narrative and can therefore create a bit of a bump for readers as they transition from past to present within the story. Used well, prologues can create subtext, but used poorly, they can destroy opportunities for tasty subtext that might otherwise have existed within the story. The main challenge they create is that they force readers to begin a story twice, which means you must hook them twice. So if you do decide to utilize a prologue to share important backstory information, do it in a way that creates questions rather than offering all the answers up front. If you're offering readers a prologue, this means whatever happens in this scene must be important to pulling them into the story to follow. The prologue should create momentum, drawing readers into the need to know how the consequences of the backstory moment will play out. Now, The English utilizes a very brief prologue of sorts in which protagonist Cornelia voices over a scene of remembrance about her time in Nebraska with Eli Whip. By itself, the prologue is effective since it teases what is to come, sets up the general vibe of the story, and pulls audiences into what is to come. However, in light of the fact that the backstory flashback halfway through the show ends up completely altering the context for what is initially set up, the prologue could have been better utilized. Ultimately, flashbacks and prologues are highly specialized techniques and will not be the right choices for every story. However, when used at exactly the right moment, they can allow an author to skillfully shape the audience's experiences. Now, if flashbacks and prologues are not the right choice for your story, don't worry. Next week, we will discuss backstory techniques for stories with both linear and alternating timelines. And in the meantime, I hope you will stop by the site and tell me your opinion. What backstory techniques have you used in your stories? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.